This is an oldie, but a goldie. According to the philosopher David Hume, who wrote a good deal about this, it dates at least back to Epicurus, who was a contemporary of Aristotle, which means he's about 300 BC or something like that. And it's a puzzle to do with a couple of the features of God that we discussed in the last unit. Specifically, being all-powerful and being all-good, or if you like, all-loving, omnibenevolent, if you want to use one of the omnis. And notice it's a little weird that Epicurus came up with this, because he's living in a time when the Greek gods are neither of these things. But obviously there's talk in the air. This dates back to the pre-Socratic philosopher, so a couple of hundred years maybe before Epicurus, Xenophanes, who was already suggesting that the Greek gods weren't divine enough, and came up with an idea that sounds a lot like the god of theism. Anyway, Epicurus said, if God is all-powerful, then God should be able to prevent all suffering, right? Because God can do anything. If God loves us infinitely, then God would want to prevent all suffering. Just like you want to prevent suffering to your children, if you love them. If you don't want to prevent suffering to your children, then we should probably call the Child Protection Agency. But God's supposed to love us and, love us infinitely, so he would not want us to suffer. Well, so if he's both of those things, he can prevent all suffering and he would want to prevent all suffering, then obviously there should be no suffering, because he would want it not to be there and he can prevent it. And yet, clearly, notice that the word evil is used typically in discussion of this, the problem of evil, whereas I use suffering. The word evil is meant to encompass suffering. So we use evil more narrowly now than when it was used to refer to this. But evil, as it's being used here, encompasses suffering. So it doesn't just include, the way we use it now, which is that person is evil. In fact, evil is usually divided into two categories. Moral evil, that's the way we normally use the word evil, and what is called natural evil. And natural evil would be things that cause suffering in the natural world that we can't really blame on humans, or at least we don't typically blame on humans, like diseases or earthquakes or floods or anything like that. So evil includes both of these. And obviously there's ample amounts, almost more than you would want, certainly more than you would want, of evil in the world that we know. So given that there is evil in this world, that whereas if God existed there wouldn't be, put those two things together and it appears to show that God doesn't exist. It's a bit like saying, I have an infallible tiger repellent, and yet there are tigers. Well, that proves that your infallible tiger repellent doesn't work. It isn't really infallible. But of course, God is by definition these things. So if God lacks these things, then there is no God. So yes, you have to include into this, God is necessarily omnipotent. Because notice that the obvious solution to the problem of evil, yes, this is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the challenge of explaining evil. This here you could call the argument from evil. It exploits the problem to argue that it means that in fact God doesn't exist. And this is in fact the deductive argument from evil. That is, it's a deductive argument supposedly if the premises are true, that guarantees that the conclusion is true. It's a logical argument. And by the nature of deductive arguments, if you disagree with the conclusion, and yet it's a valid argument, so a valid argument says that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Now, if the conclusion isn't actually true, what that will mean is that at least one of the premises would have to be true, because given that it's a valid argument, if the premises were all true, then that would guarantee that the conclusion has to be true. So if you're saying the conclusion is not true, God does in fact exist, it's on you as someone who believes in God to show that one of the premises is false, or give a convincing story that makes it possible that one of the premises is false. Well, how about premise number one? If it's not true that God is omnipotent, then you don't have the problem. In fact, this is why religions like the Greek religions do not have a problem of evil. The problem of evil is only a problem for religions like the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that are committed to these properties of God. If you believe, as the Greeks did, that the gods are just super powerful assholes, who get to do whatever they want and aren't necessarily good, then there's no puzzle about where evil comes from. It's just the gods messing with humans as they like to do. It's only if you believe that God is all-powerful and all-good that you have this problem. So, a solution to the problem of evil is to deny one of these things. But what that solution entails is rejecting theism. A theistic solution to the problem of evil cannot reject either of these, because theism, certainly perfect being theology, which is what theism has been at least since Aquinas, is committed to those. So you can't deny those. So if you're going to solve the problem of evil and stay committed to theism, you have to deny either number 3 or number 4. Number 4 is a bit of a non-starter. Some people have suggested this, but it's just, you're never going to convince me, certainly, and not most people. Now, the problem of evil is one of those problems that permeates a lot of popular culture. I could rattle off a bunch of pop songs that try to tackle the problem of evil. Do people know Depeche Mode anymore? They were huge in the 80s and 90s, particularly in Los Angeles. There was one radio station where they were on constantly called K-Rock, and they played stadia. So they were a big band at one point. Well, they had a song called Blasphemous Rumors. I forgot what was the line. I don't want to start any blasphemous rumors, but I think that God's got a sick sense of humor. And when I die, I expect to find him laughing. And it describes in the story, it describes in the verses how this girl has an almost death experience. She almost ODs, I think, and then has a Christian conversion when she survives the OD, and then gets run over and killed. So after she cleans up her life, that's when she gets killed. And it says, this doesn't seem like this fits with the idea of a good God. There are plenty more worse things. Another famous discussion of the problem of evil is in the great Russian novel, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, where two brothers, one of them, Alyosha, is planning to become a monk, and the other one, Ivan, is kind of wants to talk him out of him, and he presents him with the problem of evil, and he tells them stories of just horrible things that have happened that Dostoevsky literally just took from the newspapers at the time. So one of the stories in the book is a general who likes to go hunting, sees a small boy who's just playing in the street and throwing rocks around, and throws a rock, and it hits the paw of the general's favorite hunting dog, and gives it a temporary limp or something like that. So to punish him, the general has the boy stripped naked and sets him loose, and then he sets his hounds on the boy. He hunts the boy like a fox, and the hounds tear the boy apart in front of the boy's mother. And this actually happened. And the general, because he was some important figure, just got a slap on the wrist. Another example that I came across when I was teaching bioethics is this horrible syndrome called Hallopos-Siemens syndrome. This is some kind of genetic, well, I don't know if it's genetic, but it's a condition to do with whether or not your skin has the right number of proteins or something. It's a rare condition, but certainly babies have been born with it. And if you're born with it, once you hit the atmosphere, you're okay when you're in utero in the amniotic fluid, but once you're born and you're exposed to air, your skin just starts to slough off. Your skin doesn't form properly. So these babies are in constant agony because they essentially have no skin. And if you try to feed them, the roof of their mouth collapses. So you have to sort of ram a tube down their throat, and it's constant agony until they die. There is no treatment for Hallopos-Siemens. They cannot be cured. They will just live in agony until they die. In fact, where I came across it was what convinced a doctor in the Netherlands that they needed to have the possibility of infant euthanasia, because he had a baby with this, and he was so upset with the fact that they weren't allowed to just peacefully put this baby to sleep. They had to keep it alive and in constant agony until it died of natural causes, which happens fairly soon. But it took a year for this baby to die, and it's just in constant agony the whole of its existence. And he said it's just cruel to keep it alive. It would be better, and the parents are just destroyed by watching their child go through this. This is a real thing. Why does this exist? You could say that's the problem of evil. Why does God let something like this exist? So, this is a challenge for people who believe in this. In response, attempts to solve the problem and respond to this argument are called theodicies. The term was invented by a guy called Leibniz. Now, Leibniz's version of a theodicy isn't even in this list. It's discussed in the chapter in the book that you read. Leibniz famously is responsible for the idea of possible worlds, which are used a lot in philosophy these days, and they're like alternate possibilities. And nowadays, you know them as the metaverse in Marvel Comics or Infinite Worlds in DC. It's basically alternate universes. And Leibniz argued, famously, that the universe we live in must be the best of all of these possible universes. Why? Because otherwise God wouldn't have made it. God could have made any of the others, and notice in some of the others, you're the emperor of the world. There is a possible world where you're in charge. Well, I'm sorry, that wasn't one of the good ones, or at least not as good as this one, because according to Leibniz, otherwise, obviously, God would have created this one. This idea that this world, look around you, this world is the best of all possible worlds, was so repugnant to the French thinker Voltaire that he wrote a whole satirical work about it called Candide. In that work, there's a guy called Dr. Pangloss, who's basically convinced of Leibniz's theory and keeps repeating, as horrible things happen to him and his family and all that he holds dear, he keeps saying, well, it's the best of all possible worlds, and it's meant to, the things that happen to him are an obvious counterexample to this idea. So Leibniz's theodicy is not very plausible, but he's the guy who came up with the word, and we use it now. All right, what are some perhaps more plausible theodicies that people are likely to believe? One of them is the counterpart theodicy. Now notice, I was going to say, what about a theodicy that denied that there was evil? Well, in some sense, some of these do, because what they actually say is, this isn't really evil when you look at the big picture. You just think it's evil because you're focusing on the negative, but it's such a beautiful part of the big picture. It's a bit like, you might say, if you just looked at a dot of a certain color, you would say that's an ugly color. But then when you see it in context of a picture, you see that it improves the overall picture. That although the color in isolation is ugly, its contribution to the overall picture is such that the picture would be worse without it. So in that sense, the color isn't really ugly, you might say, because of its role in the overall picture. Most theodicies are telling something like that theory. But certainly, if a theodicy has to claim Halippos Siemens is not bad, is not evil, is not suffering, nobody's going to believe that, I hope. That's just bullshit. So a better approach is to, and this is the main approach of just about every theodicy, is to challenge number 3, is to say, so a theodicy tells a story so that God can be all-powerful and all-good, and yet because of some extra details that they fill in, he has to allow evil. Now notice I said has to allow evil. Doesn't that seem like it's a sort of sneaky way of actually denying that God is all-powerful? Because why does God have to do anything? You're saying to achieve this end he wants, God has to allow evil. Why? Why can't he achieve the end that he wants without allowing evil? And that's what, in general, seems to trip up most of these theodicies. Basically, they're just attempts to disguise what they're really doing, which is denying that God is all-powerful. So they're not really theistic solutions. Now, why can't you say, okay, theism should give up this commitment that God is all-powerful? Well, be careful what you wish for, because one of the reasons that theism is committed to the idea of God is all-powerful is the role that God plays in religion. God has to solve all problems. If God, there is Augustine, the earlier of the two sort of titanic Christian philosophers, Augustine in about 300s AD, Aquinas in, I want to say, 1300s AD. Those are the two biggies. Augustine was, in his youth, he subscribed to something called Manichaeanism, which is an early offshoot of Christianity. There were some weird versions of Christianity in the early days, and Manichaeanism was one of them. Manichaeanism is I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't the inspiration for the Force in Star Wars. Because, according to Manichaeanism, there are two equally powerful forces in the universe. There's the dark and the light. And they're perpetually at war with each other. And according to Manichaeanism, there is no problem of evil. The explanation of why there's evil is that sometimes the dark wins. So when evil happens, that's when the dark is winning, because that's what the dark wants. It is not all good. It's very much the opposite. It wants evil to win. And then when good happens, it's when the god of good, the force of good is winning. So there are two forces, and they might be personified. This is a bit like the discussion in Hinduism. Is there a god like in theism, or is it sort of an impersonal force? Well, the same discussion in Manichaeanism. So Augustine was, because of his own wrestling with the problem of evil, drawn to Manichaeanism as a solution. Now, if you give up God being omnipotent, you open the door to something like Manichaeanism. And I gotta say, the way some people talk about the devil, some Christians talk about the devil, it sounds like they're actually Manichaeans, because they make it sound like ooh, the devil can win sometimes against God. Not if God is all-powerful. God could smite the devil like a bug at any moment if God wanted, according to official Christian theology. So to say, if ever you say don't turn to the devil, well, just remember that God lets the devil do what he's doing, and God could stop it at any moment. Here's another little story. I taught for a while in Arkansas. I don't teach there anymore, and let's just say I didn't find Arkansas appealing. Some very nice people there, some very nice countryside, but in general, I'm glad I'm in Flint, which tells you a lot about Arkansas. Anyway, while I was there, one of my colleagues in this university in Arkansas was a guy who was he had trained to become a preacher in his youth. He was from Tulsa, which is just over the border in Oklahoma. And even though he'd lived in Arkansas for like decades, people still regarded him as an outsider because he came from Tulsa. Anyway, as far as I was concerned, he was just like the Arkansans. He had a southern accent, and he looked like a preacher. He always wore this very starched white shirt, had a shock of white hair, spoke in this rich southern accent. But he was very much an atheist. He'd actually been converted by a very atheistic movement in the early 20th century called logical positivism. Jim Shelton, his name was, still is. And he would really freak the students out because he looked like a preacher, but he was this atheist. And the way he illustrated the problem of evil was he told a little parable. So it's like a little sermon he told. And I can't do it justice, but it was something like this. He said, imagine there's a park, and a little girl goes to play in the park, and there's an old man who likes to sit and watch her. And the old man loves the little girl, and the little girl loves the old man, and everything's peachy. And he sits and watches her as she plays in the park. But then one day, a bully comes along, and he pushes the little girl, and she falls over and she cries. And she looks over to the old man, and he doesn't do anything. He's upset because he loves her. A little tear rolls down his cheek, but he doesn't do anything. And the bully notices this. And the next day, the bully comes back and hurts her worse. He really hurts her this time. He doesn't just push her over. And still, the old man just sits there crying and doesn't do anything. And then the next day, when the little girl comes, I don't know why she keeps coming back to the park, but she does. She keeps coming back. She comes back again, and this time the bully kills her. And the old man watches and does nothing. And that's God. That's how Jim finished that. Because if you think of the little girl as us, the bully is the devil, and God is the old man. God could stop the devil doing anything, but he doesn't, and that's part of the problem of evil, according to Jim's telling. Okay, so a theodicy, the challenge of theodicy is to explain something like Halopo-Siemens condition, or the horrible things that, the moral evil that Dostoevsky discusses in Brothers Karamazov. Justify that. Explain how that's consistent with an all-good and all-powerful God. Counterpart theodicy says this. In order to have good, you must have evil. Why? Because they are logical counterparts and one cannot exist without the other. To make this plausible, imagine creating a mountain. In order to create a mountain, you have to have lowlands. Because if you don't have lowlands, you don't have a mountain. A mountain is something which by definition is higher than the land around it. So if you don't have lowlands, you can't have a mountain. Literally, a mountain cannot exist without lowlands. The counterpart theodicy says that good and evil work like that. So in order to make good in this world, God could not avoid but make evil in this world. The problem with that should be fairly obvious. Isn't God himself supposed to be all good? And didn't God create the universe? Okay, let's imagine there's a time before he created the universe. You know, if God is outside of time, there's problems with this idea, but you get the idea. So God has not yet created the universe. All that exists is God. Is there any evil? No. If God is all good, there is no evil. There's just good. Oh, so the counterpart theodicy must be false. Good and evil are not counterparts. You can have one without the other. And in general, plenty of things are not counterparts, as it says in the textbook. You know, presence of unicorn and absence of unicorn are counterparts. They're logical contradictories. But we have one of them, absence of unicorn, and it doesn't require the presence of unicorns. We have a universe, or at least certainly a world, where there's nothing but absence of unicorns. So not everything is counterparts, and it looks like good and evil are not counterparts in the way that relative things like high and low are counterparts. So the counterpart theodicy, bit of a non-starter. Surprisingly popular, but kind of obviously flawed. The contrast theodicy. The contrast theodicy is different from the counterpart theodicy in this respect. Counterpart is about existence. Good cannot exist without evil existing. Contrast is to do with how we experience the world. And I like to illustrate this with a story. Well, here's the basic idea. If we didn't suffer, we wouldn't know what pleasure was, says the contrast theodicy. So in order for us to have happiness and pleasure, we must suffer, because otherwise pleasure would not be pleasure to us. It wouldn't feel good. It would just be what there was. It would be like water to fish. They don't even notice it. So in order for us to appreciate the good, there has to be bad. And I illustrate this with a story. This was on British TV in the 70s when I was growing up. On Saturday nights was crap, because you're supposed to be out at the pub. But of course, if you're a kid, you can't be out at the pub, or at least you're not supposed to be. So you were left with whatever crappy TV was on. And I remember there was some kind of sketch show that was on, and I was watching it. And this was one of the sketches. There was two guys dressed up as what we called tramps at the time, and then we called homeless people, and now we call unhoused people, but you get the idea. And they're walking around, and they're walking for miles in the countryside, and then they stop for the night. And as they sit down, one says, "Oh, thank goodness we're stopped. Now I can take off these shoes. They're 2 sizes too small." And the other one says, "Well, why are we wearing shoes 2 sizes too small? I saw a pair of shoes back there that were the right size for you. Why are you wearing shoes that are too small?" And the other one said, "Are you kidding? This is the best part of the day." The point being, he gets pleasure from the ending of his suffering. The best feeling in the world is taking off the shoes that are too small. That's the idea behind the contrast theodicy. Problem with the contrast theodicy is, well, there's a couple of problems. Imagine babies who die before they're able to experience anything and go to heaven. Can they not experience the pleasures of heaven? Heaven is supposed to be lacking in suffering. So can they never experience the pleasures because they've never suffered? The other problem, of course, is even if it were true that the only way we could experience happiness is if we suffered, well, for one thing, why? That implies that God couldn't have made it otherwise, which sounds like a limit on God's power. But also, we don't need this much suffering. And also, even if we needed small amounts of suffering for each person to be able to appreciate the good, it should be distributed better. There should be a little bit of suffering for everybody, but mostly good. Why is it that these babies are born with haloposemens and they only get suffering, nothing but suffering, and other people have it sweet? So the contrast theodicy just raises more questions than it answers. All right, so what about punishment? This one, again, pretty popular. I don't know if you remember Hurricane Katrina. Probably a lot of you are too young to remember that, but Hurricane Katrina was this big hurricane in 2005 now, I guess, which basically destroyed New Orleans. Again, you might not know who Pat Robertson is. I believe he's still alive. He's very ancient now. He was already old at the time. But he's a very popular preacher on TV, has his own channel and everything. And he blamed Hurricane Katrina on, get this, Ellen DeGeneres. And this was before all the stuff about Ellen being actually really nasty behind the scenes came out. So Ellen was just some comedian. And she was famous at the time because she didn't have a talk show, she had a sitcom, and on the sitcom her character came out as gay, and as Ellen DeGeneres actually is gay. So Pat Robertson's explanation for why the hurricane destroyed New Orleans is because that's where Ellen DeGeneres is from. It's true, she's from New Orleans. And so, explain this. The answer is, it's like God's punishment. It's about like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which, again, most biblical scholars say that the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah is for inhospitability. It's not actually to do with homosexual acts. But, let's not get into that. Anyway, at least though, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed as punishment for their sins. So, suffering, evil, is punishment. Now, this works better if we interpret number 2 as God is all good. And we think of all good as involving justice. So God is all powerful, God is all good. Why do some people suffer? Because they should. Because if they didn't suffer, that would be wrong. There would be an injustice allowed in this world. So the fact that suffering exists is actually part of God being good because people are getting it who deserve it. Now, this is actually covertly related to the free will theodicy that we'll get to in a minute. But there's an obvious problem with this. Let's go back to Hallopo Siemens. What did that poor kid do to deserve the punishment? This only makes sense if the only people who suffer are people who deserve it. That's obviously not true. Now, some people attempt to save the punishment theodicy by saying, well, we're all guilty because of something like, we're all inheritors of original sin. Babies are born sinful because they inherit the sin from their parents. We don't believe that anymore. That's an old-fashioned idea that we don't believe. We don't believe that children should be punished for the sins of their parents. In fact, we think that's abhorrent, and that's not something a good God would do. So, goodbye punishment theodicy. The worst problem with that is babies suffering. Okay, soul making. This is associated with a theologian called John Hick, a very well-respected 20th century theologian, John Hick. And he argues that this world is sort of a training ground in this world. So, because actually if you think of the story of, I'm going to go with Christianity because that's with what I'm most familiar, the story of Christianity is this world in which we live is actually a very unimportant, minuscule part of our total existence. Because we're going to live infinitely in the afterlife. And incidentally, John Hick was a universalist. And what universalists are, as we'll find out, not the church universalism, but universalists are people who believe that everybody who dies is saved. Everybody goes to heaven. Nobody goes to hell. That's what he believes. So, most of our existence is going to be spent in heaven. Essentially 100%, because if you live in infinity in heaven and a finite amount in earth, infinity is essentially equivalent to 100% of your existence. So what is the point of this little shitty part of our existence before the good stuff? He says the point of it is to prepare our souls for their eternal life. The only way we can come to deep, profound knowledge of good And the only way we can have the right kinds of characters that are needed in heaven is if we go through a series of tests. Like, you can only become a good person if you've suffered a bit, if you've been tested. If, little kids don't know the world, don't understand, they're unformed. It's only when you've gone to the school of hard knocks that you have acquired the sort of knowledge you need. Your soul is fully formed when you've gone through the flames of this existence. So that's why we need suffering, because it's soul-making. Again, this appears to undermine God's omnipotence. I mean, the good end that is supposed to be served is us having a fully formed soul. Why doesn't God make us with that fully formed soul? Why not? Why do we have to? It's as if, suppose I have two ways of producing a good car. Make it perfect the first time, or make a series of imperfect models, testing them so that people die, and then correcting them steadily until I get the perfect one. Can I justify the people dying by the perfect car? Only if it wasn't possible to produce the perfect car without all of that. But if God is omnipotent, he could just make us with fully formed souls, right? Presumably, God's soul has always been perfect. Would he have been better if he had to have a trainee period where he suffered? I don't think anybody thinks that of God. So why should it be true of us as well? So the soul-making theodicy, again, has some implausibilities. And also, of course, in what way was the baby who had Haloposemens, how was that forming their soul? Now you could argue, well, actually that was forming the soul of their parents. Their parents had to suffer. But that sort of assumes that it's true. What does not kill me makes me stronger. And that's bullshit. Number one, that was Nietzsche, who was very much an anti-Christian. And number two, it's just not true. What does not kill me sometimes breaks me irretrievably, right? If you've had a child die this way, nothing good comes of that. That's just, whenever you remember it, it's just suffering. It's just more suffering. So that's not, and one more point. Let's suppose it were true that having their baby suffer made them better people. That's unfair to the baby. That's like saying your suffering is good for other people. That's why you're suffering, not for your benefit, but for other people's benefit. Now, one person who thinks that's okay is Swinburne, who you read a chapter from. And we'll say a little bit about Swinburne in a minute. But that's the part. I don't find much that Swinburne writes very convincing, and certainly that part not convincing. Anyway, that's John Hick's soul-making theory, and again, it appears to imply that God couldn't achieve that end without going through this process, and that just doesn't seem consistent with an omnipotent God. So that brings us to the last and greatest theodicy, which is the free will theodicy. Here's how that works. There are two key elements to it. Let's talk about the second one. It doesn't matter what order you write them in. I just wrote them in this order. So let's talk about the second one first. According to the free will theodicy is committed to this idea, first of all, that there is this thing, free will, and that humans have it, and that it is very good that they have it. So a world with free will in it is better than the best world without free will, even if, as this other principle says, free will necessarily brings evil. So God's thinking of creating the world. He says, here are my options. I could create a world where everybody is happy all the time, no evil. That's in my power. I'm omnipotent. I could do that. But they're not free. Why are they not free? Because I'm making sure that they always do good. I'm setting it up so that they always do good. So clearly they can't be free. Alternatively, I could make this other world where I give them freedom, But sadly, because of this, free will always necessarily brings evil. Because if you create people free, you can't control them. If they're genuinely free, they'll do whatever they want. And maybe that'll be evil. That'll be evil sometimes, because that's what freedom brings. Free will necessarily brings evil. So I've got to decide. Do I want the perfect world without freedom, or do I want the flawed world with lots of evil in it, but also free will? And the free will theodicy says the world with the free will and the evil is by its nature just better. So essentially it's saying free will is good enough, is so important and valuable that it's sort of the presence of the free will counteracts the evil and more than makes up for it. Put those two together and you've got a working theodicy, because a good God would create the world with the free will in it because it's better, and yet would not be able to prevent there being evil in that way. So the fact that there is evil is explained, it's not God's fault. It's God's fault. It's the fault of the free beings in this world. So that's the other thing. The free will theodicy implies that all of the evil in this world is as the result of bad things that free beings in here do. Now, this doesn't just have to be humans. This can include Satan. Satan could be a free being who is producing evil stuff. Now, an obvious problem with this, remember the problem with the punishment theodicy. That didn't seem to explain Halippos-Siemens, because Halippos-Siemens was suffering that happened to an innocent being. Well, what about the free will theodicy? How does that explain Halippos-Siemens? How is Halippos-Siemens the fault of free action? Why that baby's suffering? How did that result from the free will of humans, for example? So it seems like the free will theodicy gives a plausible explanation of moral evil, but not of natural evil. How do you explain natural evil? Now, in his chapter, Swinburne gives an attempt to explain natural evil. And I just find it mind-boggling. But perhaps a more plausible one is given by a guy called Alvin Plantinga. And he says natural evil is the result of free actions of people like Satan. So the reason why we have Halippos-Siemens is Satan is acting freely, and he is freely creating stuff to torture humans. At this point, recall Jim Shelton's story of the old man in the park. What do we think of that old guy? He could prevent the bully from torturing and killing the little girl, and he doesn't. Why? Because he respects the free will of the bully. Is the free will that valuable? Shouldn't God stop the devil creating Halippos-Siemens? Is the devil's freedom more valuable than that baby's suffering? You have to believe it if you're convinced by the free will theodicy. Now, okay, but on the face of it, certainly it looks like a pretty plausible and certainly the most powerful theodicy. What are the problems with it? Well, one problem with it is it's committed to a view of freedom that many philosophers think is hopelessly flawed. And this is the view of freedom that is associated with libertarianism. Now, confusingly, this is not the political view. Libertarianism, like, Ron Paul or Rand Paul, those guys. They just believe in no taxes. My money is mine. I'm not giving it to poor people. You can't force me. That's political libertarianism. Metaphysical libertarianism is the idea that in order to be free, your action must be completely uncaused. So, according to metaphysical libertarianism, it has to be the case that the complete history of the universe up to this point doesn't determine whether I do A or B. You can know every single thing about me and still not know if I am going to help an old lady across the street or push her under a bus. Both of those are equally consistent with what I'm like, including, and this includes, of course, every fact about my character and my personality. I could have been a moral saint up to that point, but in order for me to be free, it has to be possible that I would push her under the bus. And if it's not possible, if the universe is such that it's literally not possible for me to push her under the bus, then I'm not free. Okay, the problem with libertarianism, first of all, the reason why this view requires libertarianism is because without libertarianism, God could have made the world where we're free and we never do evil. He could have set up the laws of the universe so that we are caused to do good things, and if that's what freedom is, because actually there's a significant chunk of philosophers who believe this is what freedom is. Freedom is me doing what I want to do. This is a very simplistic version, and it's actually more sophisticated than that, but essentially freedom is when I'm in control of my actions, not somebody else, and I'm doing what I want to do. I am unfree when somebody else forces me to do something, or I'm brainwashed, or I am coerced into doing things that I don't really want to do. But if I'm doing what I want to do, like there's a burger there, I want the burger, I eat the burger, that's freedom, even if that was perfectly predictable given the matter that I'm made of and that the laws of physics determine that that's what I would do. That is probably a more popular view of freedom amongst contemporary philosophers. And of course, if that's the right view of freedom, then the free will theodicy doesn't work. Because if that view is correct, God could have set up a world. This is false. If compatibilism, the name of that view, is true. But in general, actually, well, before I go on, the trouble with libertarianism, according to compatibilists, the reason why you should reject this view is because it's not freedom, it's randomness. Libertarians say, I could have a completely saintly personality and I could still do a horrible action. Now, I would be surprised at myself doing this. I would say, well, that's not like me, but that's what freedom requires. According to compatibilists, that's not freedom, that's randomness. That's just something happened to you. Unless what you're doing is caused by the way you really are, then you're not free. If, my arm flies up and I have no idea why it did that, it just did that, that's not me acting freely, that's just shit happening to me. But that's what libertarianism defines as freedom. So that's why a lot of people reject libertarianism. But even if libertarianism is true, this doesn't seem to be true. Why? Well, God. God is free, right? Does God ever do wrong? No. So, free will does not necessarily bring evil. It is possible to be free without ever doing evil, and God is evidence. So, that's just not true. But even if you think, well, we have a different kind of freedom from God and, blah, 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 in which case, if God is all-powerful, why can't he give us the good stuff? Here is something called the heaven dilemma, which I came up with, which is a problem for the free will theodicy. Okay, so for the heaven dilemma to get off the ground, you have to believe two things about heaven. Heaven is the best place. It's better than here. Okay, everyone agree with that? Yes, because it's heaven, right? If that wasn't true, it wouldn't be heaven. Two, there is no evil in heaven. Nobody does evil in heaven. Now, most people would give you that. If both of those things are true, then here's the dilemma. Are we free in heaven? The answer is either yes or no. Has to be one or the other. If the answer is yes, and heaven is the best place and there's no evil in heaven, then that shows that this is false. Because this says that you can't be free without there being evil. But if we're free in heaven and there's no evil in heaven, that's false. You can be free without evil. So if the answer to this question is yes, then this first claim of the free will theodicy is false. If the answer is no, we're not free in heaven, but heaven is the best place, then the second one is false, because this says a world with free will and evil is better than the best world. But if we're not free in heaven and heaven is the best place, then it's not true that a world with free will is better than the best place. Heaven is the best place and there's no free will. One of those two has to be true. Either we're free or we're not. If the answer is yes, then this is false. If the answer is no, then this is false. Either way, one of them is false, and you need both of them for the free will theodicy to work. So consequently, the free will theodicy does not work. There you go. Now, let's talk a little bit about a couple more features. There is something called a defense, which is slightly different from a theodicy. A theodicy is an attempt to explain what is in fact the case. Why is there really evil? What's the explanation? And if you believe in the theodicy, this is the actual explanation for why they're evil. So a theodicy should be something that a believer can tell to someone who is suffering. Why did my child die of Halipo-Siemens? Why did I do all of these good things and yet horrible things happen to me, whereas my neighbor is completely evil and only good things happen to him? Why, please? A theodicy should be the answer, and it should satisfy you. It should make you feel, okay, yes, God is still good. None of these do this very successfully. Now, what Alvin Plantinga, American Calvinist philosopher, no, actually, he's at Notre Dame, I think, but I think he is Calvinist, which is odd, so he's not a Catholic. But anyway, famously he came up with this thing called the free will defense. And according to the free will defense, he says, let's lower the standards. I'm not going to tell you what I think is actually true. I'm going to tell you a possible story. And the point is, if it's possible, then it shows that this doesn't work. Because if it's possible, then one of the premises could be false. So instead of saying that one of the premises is false, what a theodicy says, it's saying you can't know that the premises are all true. One of them could be false. Long story short, his theory says that it's possible that God can't actualize all the possible worlds. And the possible world where everyone is free, because actually Mackie makes the point that I made more briefly. I said God has a freedom where he doesn't do evil, but he is free. Mackie says, look, it's possible that humans do that. Imagine God makes a universe with just one human in it, and it only lasts as long as they get to make one decision. Obviously, it's possible for them just to do good. In the entire existence of that universe, only good happens, and there's a free being in it. So there's an example that proves that that's not true always. And if it's possible in that universe, then it's possible if you give them two decisions. If there's two people doing two decisions, they could always choose the good. So God could create that universe full of free beings, and they only choose the good, says Mackie. Plantinga says, well, in theory, that is possible. You are right. That is a possible world. But despite what Leibniz says, this is not the best of all possible worlds, because not all possible worlds are actualizable. So Plantinga makes this distinction between worlds that are possible and worlds that God can actualize. To me, this is just obviously saying that God is not omnipotent, because there's a possible world that God cannot make real. It's possible, but God can't make it actual. Then he's not all-powerful. I thought with God all things were possible. That's what it says in the Bible. Anyway, that's Plantinga, and he's made a lot of hay out of that argument. Open theism. Open theism is the view that Swinburne holds. And I explained it last time when we were talking about omniscience and freedom. The idea of open theism is God is in time, and humans have libertarian freedom, and therefore God cannot predict what they will do, because you can know everything about the history of the universe, and humans can still surprise you. So it's committed to libertarian freedom with all of the problems that I gave about that. But that's why there's evil in the world, because God made a world in which he couldn't predict what they would do. So he couldn't make a perfect world because he couldn't predict what they do. In Mackey's telling of the story, God can make a world because even if these people are acting genuinely freely, he can sort of see how the entire world will play out, and he will make the world where all the people happen to make all the right choices. According to Swinburne's view, God is not outside of time, so he can't know that. He can't predict with perfect accuracy what people will do. So he took a gamble, and we let him down. We're free agents, and we did the wrong thing. So he's really committed to this idea that free will is so good that even all of the suffering that it could be, and on this view, everything could really go to shit, right? Because for all God knows, we could turn this world into a hell. And that kind of fits, actually, with the story of the flood. Maybe that's what happened. God sort of made a first attempt, and then we just went off the rails, and we became so bad that God said, okay, got to kill them all and start again. Isn't that the story of Noah's flood? So Swinburne could say, the free will is so valuable that it's worth it. And he actually tells this story that in order, the value that comes from free will, according to Swinburne, is that we make responsible choices. And responsible choices require you choosing between good and evil. So there has to be evil to allow us to be able to make responsible choices. Otherwise, it's just, baby choices. It's not real choices. So notice that an implication of his view is that we don't have the really good stuff in heaven. We don't have the really valuable, responsible choices in heaven. So in some sense, heaven is not as good as earth. Why, according to Swinburne? Because we've got all the good suffering here. And even the people who get nothing out of suffering, they do get something out of suffering because they're helping other people make free and responsible choices, even if they make the wrong choices. So the value that a victim of a serial killer gets out of being killed by a serial killer is that they're helping the serial killer make responsible choices. That's Swinburne's view. I gotta say, it's a ballsy view. It's not a view that has converted me, but see if it works on you. But that's sort of committed to the open theism. God is taking a huge gamble. Maybe God will say, it just didn't work out and we'll have another flood. That's entirely possible according to open theism. But it's worth it because free and responsible choice, so valuable. Even though libertarianism, according to its critics, is just randomness. Very quickly, there are alternative versions of the argument from evil. There's inductive and abductive. And I want to say just a little bit about those, but not as much as they do in the chapter, because I happen to think that Plantinga hasn't really destroyed this argument as the writers of the chapter do. They think this argument has pretty much been dealt with, so we need a new argument from evil, and I disagree. But I will say a couple of things about these. Now, an inductive argument is an argument where the premises do not guarantee the conclusion, they just make it more likely. So it's like every time I've stuck my hand in a flame, it's hurt. I've done it 10 times and it's hurt every time. Conclusion, if I do it tomorrow, it will hurt. Now, the premises do not guarantee the conclusion, but you can see that they make the conclusion pretty likely. That's a good inductive argument. It's entirely possible that I stick my hand in the flame and it doesn't hurt tomorrow. That's possible. And like I said, here's an example of an apparently strong inductive argument failing. I jump off a building. Every time I fall past a floor, I think to myself, so far so good. And I fall past 30 floors and I think, well, every floor I've fallen past, I've survived. Therefore, I can believe with increasing strength that I will survive falling past the next floor. Eventually, I'm going to get a nasty surprise, and that inductive argument is going to turn out to fail. So the premises, however well supported, aren't guaranteed. So that's why people prefer deductive arguments if possible. The benefit that inductive arguments have is that the conclusion can genuinely go beyond the premises. That can't happen in a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, the premise is in some sense contained within, the conclusion is in some sense contained within the premises. So you're just restating what the premises already say. In an inductive argument, you can have particular claims and then draw a general conclusion which goes beyond the premises, which is why the premises can't guarantee it. So for example, polling is an example of an inductive argument. You say 90% of the people we polled, and we set up a polling group that was representative of the general population. We ask 1,000 people that break down demographically like the USA, and 70% of them say this. Therefore, we conclude 70% of the United States believe this. Could fail, but polling is often very, very accurate. So, and it saves you having to poll the entire United States. So there's a lot of value to some inductive arguments, and all of science is essentially inductive arguments. That said, I think this is a case where the deductive argument is preferable if it works. So the inductive argument is a fallback. And the inductive argument is about suffering of a fawn being justified and concluding that no suffering of the fawn could be justified, so therefore there is evil and God can't justify it. And then there's a back and forth about that. See what you think. Abductive. What is an abductive argument? An abductive argument is more informatively called inference to the best explanation. Here's an example of that. Imagine I've got two, here's what happens. I've got a black box, and there's a switch on it, and there's a light bulb on top, and there's a wire going into it. I flick the switch, and the light bulb comes on. Now, it's a black box, so I literally don't know what's inside the black box, but I could, that's what black box means nowadays, thing that you don't know what's inside it. I could come up with all sorts of explanations. Here are two. One of them is that there's a wire going to the switch and then to the light bulb, and the switch, when I flick it, completes the circuit and connects electricity to the light bulb. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that the wire goes through the switch to another light bulb inside the box, and the light bulb is next to a photoelectric cell, so that when that light goes on, it feeds energy to the photoelectric cell, which then sends energy to something that completes another switch and lights the light bulb. So that second explanation also explains the phenomena that we're familiar with. We know that flicking the switch makes the light goes on. Both of those hypotheses explain that. Which of them is the best explanation? Clearly, we say the simpler one is the best explanation. In fact, that principle that the simpler one is the best explanation is famously Occam's razor. Occam's razor says when you've got two competing explanations for the same thing, the simpler one is the better one. And I haven't recorded the video for the argument from design, but if you watch that one first, you will know what an abductive argument is, because I'll explain the same thing with the argument from design. Okay, what's the abductive argument from evil? It's essentially saying that the best explanation of the existence of pain is that there is no God, because the explanation of pain makes sense according to natural selection, because natural selection is an imprecise, flawed mechanism. We are not nobody who believes that we are the products of natural selection believes that we are perfectly designed. All that needs to be true for natural selection to have designed us is that we survive long enough to reproduce. Consequently, it's perfectly consistent with natural selection that we have all kinds of design flaws. One design flaw is our blind spot. Again, this will be familiar from the other video that I haven't recorded yet. But octopuses don't have the blind spot because they happen to have evolved with their optic nerve going in the back. We happen to have evolved with it going in the front. It was good enough. It's not a great design, but it works. And that's all that needs to be true is we survive long enough to reproduce. And then that will be the system that survives and is passed on to our offspring. So according to natural selection, there can be all kinds of problems, including pain. Pain works as an indicator of, so it's good that we feel pain when we put our hands in the flame. There are some people with a condition who don't feel pain, and their parents must be terrified because they will never know if their appendix is rupturing. They will never know if they've broken their legs. So you have to basically keep these children in bubble wrap precisely because they can't feel pain. So pain is very useful, but of course, then we get all kinds of pain that is not useful, chronic pain, phantom pain. That's consistent with natural selection, but doesn't seem to be consistent with a good God. So that's the point he's making. The best explanation for phenomena that we observe, specifically pain, is that there is no God. Okay, true, but I think you've still got the logical argument from evil, which is more powerful. The problem of evil.